We saw the possibilities of a new order
and the hope that each of us has to build a new world order.
The embryo of a political union.
It is not new, and it is not order.
I have a PhD in political science. I taught English at the University of California for 34 years. And now that I'm retired, I can devote all my time to writing books about deep politics. With the development of the atomic bomb, people worried about the decapitation of the American government. And so ever since the 50s, there have been groups of people, usually very interesting people, planning for what would happen if there was a nuclear attack and the government was, as they say, decapitated. And under Reagan, that planning went off in a new direction. Two of the key people doing the secret planning then were Cheney and Rumsfeld, although Cheney was just an ordinary congressman under Reagan, and Rumsfeld was the CEO of a drug company, but they were empowered to consider. They worked with Oliver North, and it was called Plans for the Suspension of the Government. And they changed the conditions. There was a special executive order which said it would no longer be for an atomic attack, but for any emergency. And that's why it was possible for COG actually to be instituted for the first time on September the 11th, which of course was not an atomic attack. By that time, Cheney and Rumsfeld had been working on the planning for 20 years. And in the late 90s, neither Cheney nor Rumsfeld was in the government. They were both CEOs of corporations. What this means, the only way the best evidence we have about it is to go back to when Oliver North was quizzed about it in the Iran-Contra hearings, and he was asked if he was working on plans to suspend the American Constitution. And the chairman of the committee, the Iran-Contra committee, banged his gavel and said, "We can't go into that in a public session," which sort of corroborated that he knew what was being talked about and there was something there. I think that many of the things that are most disturbing that we've seen since 9/11, the end of habeas corpus, warrantless detention, warrantless surveillance, and above all, preparations for martial law. Those are things that were described about this planning back in the 80s, and we've seen them all come to fruition since 9/11. So in my book, The Road to 9/11, I speculate that this is part of the COG plan that was implemented. The fact is we don't know, Congress doesn't know, and when Congressman DeFazio of the Homeland Security Committee saw that the state of emergency authorizing this had been renewed yet again in 2007, and that there were COG provisions in the classified annex, he asked to see them, and he was told he didn't have the clearance to see them. And then the Homeland Security chairman on stationery officially asked and was told that the committee didn't have the clearances to see what the COG planning was. So that this is we're getting to two levels of government here. One level of government where we have checks and balances, what we call the constitutional government, and a higher level of COG government where the constitutional authorities are not allowed to go. I don't want to get too much into detail, but I think a lot of what we don't understand about what happened on the morning of 9/11 and what Cheney was doing that morning, which is he's given two different versions of, all has to do that he was doing things on a COG phone, which wasn't even in the bunker under the White House, was in a more secure place. And that's why the 9/11 Commission looked for authorization to bring the planes down and so on, and they couldn't find that authorization. There's just there's some kind of gap in the telephonic communication, and I think the answer is it's because we were going now to COG communications instead of ordinary communications. A state of emergency cannot last for more than a year and has to be renewed. And without mentioning the act, Bush did annually renew. And so it was clear when Obama was elected that we were going to find out what Obama would do. And a former Congressman, Dan Hamburg, and myself appealed to Obama, first of all, not to renew it, and also we appealed to Congress to observe another part of the same law that says that if there's any state of emergency is declared, then Congress shall, it's not an option, they're required by law to review it within 6 months and either terminate it or render it official. And we were waiting to see, and unfortunately Obama disappointed us just in September 2009. He then did, for the first time mentioning the act, say that under the terms of the act he was extending the state of emergency for another year. But this is not really a legal state of emergency under the act, because for it to be legal, Congress should have approved it. And it was a terrible disappointment that we asked on the internet, we asked people to write their congressman, make sure Congress did this. And one congressman wrote back and said to his constituent and said, we understand that the provisions of this act have been overridden by, guess what, COG. So it's another indication that COG is overriding the constitutional and legal provisions that protect us in this country. The word parapolitics, I defined it in my book as, with the CIA in mind, forms of politics in which accountability is consciously diminished. Now, the word is caught on. It's being used by all kinds of people, and it's being used slightly differently today, mostly because of what's happened in Colombia. I think now in Colombia you have a government, but you also have these paramilitary forces that are supported by drugs and hire themselves out to landlords to kill peasants who are organizing for their rights or to kill union organizers. There are two executives of an American company, the Drum and Coal Company, who face indictment now because they hired these para people to do this. The state is so, it's such a topic of discussion in Colombia. They keep calling the state and the para-state. The politics, which is what goes on in Congress and in Bogota, and the parapolitics, which is what's going on in the countryside when these drug forces are enforcing. And the word, so I no longer own the word, but it's roughly what I mean. I also wrote a book called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, and in that book I tried to distinguish between parapolitics, which is something you consciously do and set up as a system, versus deep politics, which is just something that you have to live with as a fact. For a long time I used these terms and the major media would not touch them, but just in the last 10 years, if you Google now, you'll see quite a few references to deep politics, or if you go to LexisNexis, better example, because that's just the mainstream media. And they are being used, they're not being distinguished. They both are being used to mean roughly the same thing. Organized crime fits into the whole structure of how this country is governed, and this helps explain how not just how Kennedy could be killed, but also, more interestingly, how the forces of government would immediately cover it up with a false story that Oswald did it and acted alone. I gave a paper about all three of the big assassinations in the 60s, which was John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And there are certain common denominators which I think reinforce what I was saying about Kennedy, John F. Kennedy alone in my book. One is that you find that there's a drug aspect to all three of those killings. There's an organized crime aspect to all three of them. I say this without pretending that I have solved those cases. I wasn't even really trying to solve the cases. I was just trying to understand how a president could be murdered, and this would be essentially absorbed into the culture of the country. We have a guy who's officially blamed for it. Most people don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald, well, they may believe he pulled a trigger, but they don't believe that he was a lone assassin. And yet, most people don't particularly care about it. We're just having to live with that. I call these events deep events. We've become accustomed to the idea that every now and then something is going to happen, and we just know from the beginning we're not going to get to the bottom of it. And the more they happen, the more reconciled we've become to this state of affairs. The obvious recent example, of course, is 9/11. Nobody's claiming we've got to the bottom of 9/11. Even the two chairmen of the committee are saying that there was a lot of falsified information given to their commission, and that the CIA didn't, they relied very heavily on information from the CIA, which they weren't able to deal with the raw data, and they now realize that the CIA was covering up to some extent in their interviews. They were relying on data that came from people who had been tortured, which means that on the face of it, it was not very reliable data. So there's a lot of people who recognize that we don't know the truth about 9/11, but here is an event which has changed the whole constitutional situation in this country, and once again we're not being allowed to look at it. People are fighting very hard to get a really independent, for the first time, a really independent investigation, and it's proving extremely difficult to do.